In 2014, a political scientist stood before a packed auditorium in Chicago and told the world exactly what would happen if the West continued its economic and military pressure on Russia. His name was John Mearsheimer. The foreign policy establishment laughed. Media pundits dismissed him. Think tanks funded by defense contractors called him naive. 8 years later, every prediction he made came true. The cost of ignoring him now sits at $10 trillion in destroyed global wealth. You were told sanctions would cripple Russia. You were told the ruble would collapse to rubble. You were told Putin would be gone within weeks. The people who told you this work in the same institutions today. They receive promotions. They write opinion columns. They appear on television as experts. Meanwhile, German factories sit idle. Sri Lanka declared bankruptcy. Pakistan begged the IMF for emergency loans. Egypt cannot afford wheat. European energy companies needed 1.5 trillion euros in emergency liquidity during a single month in 2022. Your grocery bill went up 25%. Your heating costs doubled. Your retirement account lost years of gains. The sanctions did not fail because of poor execution. The sanctions failed because they were designed by people who confused financial weapons with financial invincibility. Washington believed it controlled the arteries of global commerce. It controlled the SWIFT system. It controlled dollar clearing. It controlled the reserve currency. These were pressure points, and America squeezed them harder than any nation in history. $300 billion in Russian central bank assets frozen overnight. The largest asset seizure since World War II. But here's the part your television will not explain. When you weaponize the infrastructure of global trade, you do not destroy your enemy. You destroy trust in the infrastructure itself. 140 nations watched America freeze Russian reserves. Every finance minister in every developing country asked the same question. If they did this to Russia, what stops them from doing it to us? This is Rashi historical. History has owners. We name them. The machinery of American financial dominance took 80 years to build. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the petrodollar agreement with Saudi Arabia in 1974, the expansion of SWIFT in the 1990s, the dollarization of emerging markets through IMF structural adjustment. Every layer of this system represented accumulated leverage. Every node in the network served as both a tool for commerce and a potential weapon for coercion. For decades, this weapon sat holstered. The mere threat of exclusion kept nations compliant. The system worked because everyone believed participation was permanent. Russia proved participation was conditional. And now the system unravels. You will feel this unraveling for the rest of your life. The price of everything you buy connects to the stability of global supply chains. Those supply chains connect to shipping insurance denominated in dollars. They connect to trade finance processed through correspondent banks in New York and London. They connect to currency hedging instruments priced off treasury rates. When trust in this system fractures, the fractures spread to your gas pump, your mortgage rate, your job security, and your nation's ability to fund its debt. This is not abstract economics. This is the architecture of your daily existence under structural stress. The $10 trillion figure comes from documented sources. The International Monetary Fund calculated $2.8 trillion in global GDP losses from energy price shocks in 2022 alone. The European Central Bank documented 400 billion euros in current account deterioration across EU member states. Stock market losses in developed economies exceeded $4 trillion in 2022. Emerging market capital flight stripped another trillion from developing nations. Inflation acceleration destroyed purchasing power worth hundreds of billions more. Add the compounding effects through 2023 and 2024. Add the opportunity costs of disrupted investment flows. Add the deadweight losses from supply chain reorganization. $10 trillion represents a conservative estimate. One man warned you this would happen. His warning exists on video. It exists in academic journals. It exists in Foreign Affairs magazine. He told you the year, the mechanism, and the consequences. Understanding why he was right requires understanding the system he described. John Mearsheimer published his analysis in Foreign Affairs in September 2014, 6 months after Russia annexed Crimea. The title was direct. Why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault. The thesis was simple. NATO expansion toward Russia's borders violated an implicit agreement made during German reunification. Western economic integration efforts through the European Union Association Agreement threatened to pull Ukraine into an opposing economic bloc. Russia, like any great power facing encirclement, would respond with force. The West created the crisis. The West would bear responsibility for the consequences. The foreign policy establishment rejected this analysis with near unanimity. Mearsheimer was accused of apologizing for Russian aggression. He was accused of ignoring Ukrainian agency. He was accused of outdated Cold War thinking. The accusations came from people who had spent 20 years arguing Russia was too weak to matter and too integrated into the Western economy to risk confrontation. These same people designed the sanctions regime that would prove every assumption wrong. Mearsheimer's theoretical framework came from a school of thought called offensive realism. The core principle holds that great powers compete for security in an anarchic international system. No higher authority exists to protect states from each other. Every state must therefore maximize its relative power to ensure survival. Liberal institutions, economic interdependence, and shared values do not change this dynamic. They merely obscure it. When a rising power threatens the sphere of influence of an established power, conflict becomes inevitable, regardless of trade volumes or cultural exchange. The framework predicted Russian behavior with precision. NATO expanded to include Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1999. The Baltic states joined in 2004. Each expansion moved the Western military alliance closer to Russian territory. American policymakers believed these expansions enhanced European security. Mearsheimer argued they accomplished the opposite. They convinced Russia that Western intentions were hostile. They guaranteed a Russian response once Western expansion touched Ukraine, the most strategically significant territory on Russia's western border. The economic dimension of Mearsheimer's warning received less attention, but carried equal importance. He understood that Western economic leverage depended on Russian acquiescence. Russia supplied 40% of European natural gas. It ranked among the largest exporters of wheat, fertilizer, and critical minerals. It possessed the world's largest nuclear arsenal. A country with these characteristics did not fit the profile of a target vulnerable to economic pressure. Sanctions against Russia meant sanctions against the global commodity supply. The pain would flow in both directions. His University of Chicago lectures on Ukraine attracted small audiences before 2022. After February 2022, those same lectures accumulated tens of millions of views across video platforms. The algorithms surfaced his warnings precisely when people needed to understand how the crisis originated. Viewers watched predictions made 8 years earlier unfold in real time. The disconnect between official explanations and documented warnings generated a credibility crisis for the institutions that had dismissed him. Congressional Research Service reports now cite Mearsheimer's analysis in policy briefings. Academic journals publish retrospective assessments acknowledging his predictive accuracy. The intellectual establishment that mocked him scrambles to explain why the designated experts missed what one professor at the University of Chicago saw clearly. The answer involves incentives. The think tanks that shape foreign policy receive funding from defense contractors, governments, and financial institutions that benefit from expansion. The experts who populate these think tanks optimize for career advancement within this ecosystem. Mearsheimer operated outside it. He had no donors requiring optimistic assessments. He had no bureaucratic superiors requiring alignment with policy. He had only a theoretical framework and the discipline to apply it. The sanctions imposed on Russia beginning in February 2022 represented the most aggressive use of financial warfare in modern history. Previous sanctions regimes targeted smaller economies with limited integration into global systems: Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba. These nations possessed neither the export volumes nor the financial interconnections to generate significant blowback. Russia occupied an entirely different category. The Bank for International Settlements documented the transmission mechanisms in detail. The sanctions operated through 4 primary channels. First, asset freezes targeting the Russian central bank and state-connected entities. $300 billion immobilized in a matter of days. Second, exclusion of major Russian banks from the SWIFT messaging system, preventing them from sending or receiving international payment instructions. Third, export controls restricting Russian access to critical technologies, particularly semiconductors and precision manufacturing equipment. Fourth, price caps on Russian oil designed to reduce export revenues while maintaining supply to global markets. Each channel carried assumptions that would prove incorrect. The asset freeze assumed Russia lacked alternatives for managing its foreign exchange needs. Russia had spent 8 years building reserves in gold and currencies outside Western jurisdiction. The SWIFT exclusion assumed no alternatives existed for international payments. Russia had developed the SPFS system since 2014. China had expanded CEP since 2015. Both systems experienced rapid growth after the sanctions hit. The export controls assumed Russia could not source technology elsewhere. Chinese manufacturers filled the gap within months. The price cap assumed Russia would accept reduced revenues rather than redirect exports. Russia found eager buyers in India, China, and Turkey willing to pay above the cap through intermediary arrangements. The structural power of American financial infrastructure operated through a specific mechanism: dollar clearing. Every dollar-denominated transaction in the global economy requires processing through a correspondent bank with access to the Federal Reserve System. This creates a bottleneck. Control the bottleneck, control the flow. For decades, this bottleneck served American interests without visible coercion. Compliance happened automatically because exclusion meant economic death. The Russia sanctions revealed the bottleneck to the entire world. 140 countries watched America exercise this control against a major economy. Central bankers across the global south performed the same calculation. Their reserves sat in dollars, their trade invoices denominated in dollars, their banking relationships routed through New York. All of it depended on American permission to continue. The permission could disappear overnight based on Washington's unilateral decision. The European Central Bank documented the immediate effects on European energy markets. Natural gas prices increased by 700% between February and August 2022. German industrial production fell 15% in energy-intensive sectors. Chemical manufacturing, steel production, glassmaking, and fertilizer synthesis became uneconomical at European energy costs. Companies announced relocations to the United States and China, where energy remained affordable. The deindustrialization of Europe accelerated in months rather than decades. The September 2022 liquidity crisis exposed another vulnerability. European energy companies used derivatives to hedge their natural gas purchases. As prices spiked, margin calls on these derivatives exploded. The ECB documented 1.5 trillion euros in liquidity demand from energy companies facing collateral requirements. Governments intervened with emergency credit lines to prevent cascading defaults. The entire European energy trading system approached collapse because sanctions disrupted the price stability these derivatives required. Emerging markets experienced the boomerang through a different mechanism: capital flight. When uncertainty increases in global markets, money flows toward perceived safe havens, dollar-denominated assets in the United States. This creates a dollar shortage in developing economies. Their currencies depreciate, their import costs rise, their debt servicing burdens expand. Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Ghana, and Egypt all experienced balance of payments crises traceable to this dynamic. The IMF documented the spillover effects across 190 member countries. Nations with no involvement in the Ukraine conflict suffered economic damage from sanctions imposed thousands of miles away. The $10 trillion figure requires itemization to comprehend. Global equity markets lost $4.2 trillion in 2022. The MSCI World Index declined 18%. Technology stocks, which had powered retirement account growth for a decade, fell 33%. Bond markets performed worse. Rising interest rates driven by inflation pushed bond prices down 50% globally. Investors who held balanced portfolios lost on both sides. The International Monetary Fund World Economic Outlook for 2022 and 2023 traced the inflation transmission mechanism. Energy prices feed into transportation costs feed into goods prices feed into wage demands feed into service prices. The entire economy reprices when energy costs spike. Central banks responded with interest rate increases that suppressed demand, but also suppressed investment, hiring, and growth. The Federal Reserve raised rates from near zero to over 5% in 18 months, the fastest tightening cycle in 4 decades. European current account deterioration totaled 400 billion euros according to ECB data. Countries that previously ran trade surpluses shifted to deficits as energy import bills expanded. Germany recorded its first monthly trade deficit in 2022 since the reunification era. The accumulated trade surpluses that funded German prosperity evaporated into payments for liquefied natural gas shipped from Qatar and the United States at premium prices. Emerging market damage extended beyond the headline crises. The Federal Reserve dollar swap lines activated repeatedly in 2022, indicating financial system stress in allied nations. South Korea, Brazil, and Mexico drew on swap facilities to stabilize their currencies. These facilities exist as emergency measures. Their activation signals conditions far outside normal parameters. Food price inflation generated political instability across multiple continents. Russia and Ukraine combined supply 30% of global wheat exports. Sanctions and war disrupted both supplies. The FAO food price index reached all-time highs in March 2022. Countries dependent on grain imports faced shortages. Egypt, the world's largest wheat importer, scrambled to secure alternative supplies at elevated prices. The strain on government budgets contributed to debt crises already building from pandemic-era borrowing. Fertilizer shortages compounded agricultural stress. Russia ranks among the largest exporters of potash, nitrogen, and phosphate fertilizers. Sanctions restricted these exports. Farmers worldwide faced input cost increases of 100 to 200%. They reduced fertilizer application. Yields declined. The effects cascade through multiple growing seasons as soil nutrient depletion accumulates. The human cost remains difficult to quantify. Reduced caloric intake in food-insecure nations. Postponed medical care as healthcare budgets stretched. Educational setbacks as families withdrew children from school to work. Migration pressures as economic conditions deteriorated in origin countries. These consequences appear in no financial ledger, but represent real destruction of human welfare, attributable to the sanctions regime and its spillover effects. American consumers experienced the boomerang through inflation. The Consumer Price Index reached 9.1% in June 2022, the highest reading since 1981. Gasoline prices exceeded $5 per gallon nationally for the first time in history. Grocery prices rose 12% over 12 months. Rent increases in major cities reached 15 to 20% annually. The Federal Reserve's response, aggressive interest rate increases, added housing affordability stress as mortgage rates doubled from 3% to over 7%. The wealth destruction concentrated among those least able to absorb it. Low-income households spend higher percentages of their income on food, fuel, and housing. The inflation hit them disproportionately. Middle-class households saw retirement savings decline while living costs increased. Upper-income households with diversified assets and inflation hedges maintained their positions. The sanctions boomerang functioned as a regressive wealth transfer from ordinary citizens in sanctioning countries to shareholders of commodity producers worldwide. The weaponization of dollar infrastructure triggered a response Mearsheimer's framework predicted. States facing American financial pressure began building alternative systems. The process started slowly after 2014. It accelerated dramatically after 2022. The data documenting this shift comes from the same institutions that administer the existing system. The IMF currency composition of official foreign exchange reserves database tracks central bank holdings. In 2000, the dollar represented 71% of allocated global reserves. By 2020, that share had declined to 59%. By 2024, it fell to 58%. The decline accelerated after the sanctions hit. Central banks diversified into euros, yen, yuan, and gold. The trend line points toward a multipolar reserve currency system rather than dollar dominance. Gold purchases tell the story more vividly. Central banks bought 136 tons of gold in 2022, the highest annual total in 55 years. They bought another 137 tons in 2023. China, Russia, Turkey, India, and Poland led the accumulation. Gold represents the only reserve asset that carries no counterparty risk. No one can freeze your gold if it sits in your own vault. The lesson of the Russian asset freeze drove this behavior. Central bankers who witnessed $300 billion disappear overnight chose to hold more of their reserves in a form no foreign government could seize. China's cross-border interbank payment system processed $14.5 trillion in transactions during 2023. This figure represents a 75% increase from 2021 levels. CIPS provides an alternative to SWIFT for yuan-denominated payments. It allows participants to conduct international transactions without routing through American correspondent banks. Every major Chinese bank participates. Participation extends to banks in Russia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The infrastructure for dollar-free international commerce exists and expands. Russia's system for transfer of financial messages serves a similar function. SPFS connected over 550 organizations by 2024, including banks in Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and Tajikistan. Integration discussions continue with India and Iran. The system handles internal Russian transactions that previously relied on SWIFT. It provides redundancy against future financial warfare. BRICS expansion announced in 2023 and implemented in 2024 carries significant implications. 6 new members joined the original 5. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Argentina. The expanded grouping represents 46% of global population and 29% of global GDP. More importantly, for dollar hegemony, it includes major oil producers. Saudi Arabia's membership signals potential changes to the petrodollar arrangement that has underpinned dollar demand since 1974. The petrodollar system worked through a simple mechanism. Saudi Arabia priced oil exclusively in dollars. Countries needing oil needed dollars. They obtained dollars by running trade surpluses with the United States or by borrowing in dollar-denominated debt. This created structural demand for dollars, independent of confidence in American economic management. If major oil exporters accept payment in yuan, rupees, or other currencies, this structural demand erodes. Saudi Arabia conducted its first yuan-denominated oil sale to China in 2023. India and Russia formalized rupee-ruble payment mechanisms for bilateral trade. The UAE and China agreed to yuan settlement for Emirati oil and gas exports. Each transaction represents a small portion of global trade. The pattern these transactions establish matters more than their individual size. They demonstrate that alternatives exist and function. The parallel to British imperial decline deserves examination. Britain weaponized the pound sterling system during World War I and World War II. It froze enemy assets, restricted transfers, and compelled allies to liquidate overseas holdings to fund the war effort. These actions won battles but lost the currency war. Countries that experienced British financial coercion diversified away from sterling after the conflicts ended. The dollar replaced the pound, not through superior American virtue, but through British exhaustion of trust. America now follows the same path. The sanctions demonstrated American willingness to weaponize financial infrastructure against a major economy with minimal provocation from the American homeland itself. Russia threatened no American territory. It attacked no American citizens. It disrupted no American critical infrastructure prior to the sanctions. Washington chose confrontation over accommodation. The choice revealed the conditional nature of dollar system access. Every nation now plans accordingly. The consequences of sanctions-driven de-dollarization will unfold over decades. Financial systems possess enormous inertia. The dollar will remain the dominant reserve currency for years, but dominant and monopolistic differ. A shift from monopoly to plurality in reserve currency status changes American fiscal constraints permanently. The United States runs persistent budget deficits, funded by foreign purchases of Treasury securities. In 2024, foreign entities held approximately $7.5 trillion in Treasury debt. This demand keeps American interest rates lower than domestic savings patterns would otherwise allow. If foreign central banks reduce Treasury purchases, either the Federal Reserve must absorb the difference or interest rates rise. Either option carries costs. Fed absorption means money creation and inflation pressure. Higher rates mean increased debt service costs that already consume 15% of federal revenue. The 2024 federal deficit exceeded $1.8 trillion. Interest payments on existing debt reached $870 billion, exceeding defense spending for the first time. Projections show interest costs rising further as older low-rate debt matures and refinances at current higher rates. A world with reduced dollar demand makes this trajectory worse. Higher rates compound faster. Deficits become harder to finance. The fiscal space for domestic programs, infrastructure investment, and military spending all contract. The Treasury International Capital data shows foreign official holdings of Treasury securities declining from their 2021 peak. China reduced its holdings from over $1.1 trillion to under $800 billion. Japan, the largest holder, maintained its position but shifted towards shorter duration securities indicating reduced long-term commitment. Belgium, often used as a custodial location for Chinese purchases, also shows declining balances. These numbers represent early indicators rather than conclusive trends. Central banks do not publicly announce reserve diversification strategies. They execute gradually to avoid moving markets against their positions. The Federal Reserve monitors these flows carefully. Internal research divisions produce studies on de-dollarization that reach more alarming conclusions than public statements acknowledge. Mearsheimer's framework explains why this outcome was predictable and why policymakers ignored the prediction anyway. Offensive realism describes how states behave in an anarchic system. It does not describe how policymakers within states perceive their own actions. American officials believed they were defending a rules-based international order against a revisionist aggressor. They believed financial sanctions represented a proportionate response that would impose costs without triggering wider conflict. They believed allies would share the burden and maintain solidarity. They believed alternatives to the dollar system were too underdeveloped to matter. Each belief contained partial truth and fundamental error. The rules-based order exists to the extent American power maintains it. When that power gets exercised visibly and coercively, the rules appear less like universal principles and more like American preferences enforced at gunpoint. Allies did share the burden, but the burden fell asymmetrically. Germany deindustrializes while American LNG exporters profit. European citizens pay for American geopolitical objectives through their heating bills. Solidarity erodes under this strain. The alternatives to the dollar system were underdeveloped in 2022. They have developed rapidly since. Necessity drives innovation. Countries facing potential American financial coercion now invest in payment systems, reserve diversification, and bilateral trade arrangements that reduce their exposure. The sanctions created the political will for these investments. Without the sanctions, the dollar system faced gradual erosion over generations. With the sanctions, erosion accelerates into restructuring. The $10 trillion in wealth destruction represents only the first installment. The structural damage to American financial hegemony will compound over time. Every year, more transactions occur outside dollar channels. Every year, more reserves shift to alternative assets. Every year, more countries negotiate bilateral payment arrangements that bypass American surveillance and control. The irony deserves acknowledgement. American policymakers designed the sanctions to weaken Russia and deter future aggression by other powers. The sanctions weakened everyone. Russia adapted through trade redirection to China and India. Europe weakened through energy dependence and deindustrialization. Emerging markets weakened through inflation and capital flight. American citizens weakened through reduced purchasing power and fiscal deterioration. The dollar system weakened through demonstrated unreliability. The only parties that strengthened were those outside the system entirely. China gained a dependent Russian supplier of discounted energy and commodities. India gained leverage over both Western and Russian partners seeking its trade. Gold gained status as the only true neutral reserve asset. Commodity producers gained pricing power as supply chains reorganized around sanctions compliance. Mearsheimer warned against this outcome. He published the warning in accessible language through mainstream channels. The warning went unheeded because it contradicted institutional incentives. The think tanks advising sanctions policy employ former government officials seeking future government positions. The media outlets amplifying government narratives depend on access that critical coverage jeopardizes. The academic economists modeling sanctions. Effects use frameworks that assume rational actors and complete information, assumptions that fail precisely when they matter most. You live in the aftermath of their failure. The prices you pay reflect the boomerang they denied. The interest rates on your debt reflect the fiscal stress their policies created. The instability in your politics reflects the economic anxiety their choices imposed. The declining confidence in institutions reflects the gap between expert predictions and documented outcomes. The next decade will determine whether American policymakers learn from this failure or repeat it with China. The same voices that assured you Russian sanctions would work painlessly now assure you that Chinese decoupling will proceed smoothly. They work in the same offices. They receive funding from the same sources. They optimize for the same incentives. They were wrong before. The structure of their situation guarantees they will be wrong again. The documented evidence exists for anyone willing to examine it. BIS working papers, IMF reports, ECB reviews, Federal Reserve research, Treasury data, academic publications. The information is not hidden. It is ignored. Because acknowledging it requires acknowledging failure by the people paid to succeed. Institutions protect themselves before they protect the public they serve. Your protection comes from understanding the system they built, the weapon they fired, and the boomerang now returning. $10 trillion in destruction represents the cost of one mistake. The next mistake costs more. The pattern continues until the public that pays the price demands accountability from the experts who create it. Mearsheimer was right. The evidence proves it. The institutions that dismissed him will never admit it. You have the information now. What you do with it determines whether the next warning goes unheeded like the last.